Hello and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 11 of an exciting new series, What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at UA? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomer Bill on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now, let's dive into the story. Looking down at the gator-quirked man tripping on Trigger from where he was cornered up on some crates, Dabby considered that he might have gotten himself in a little over his head. He had only expected the gator and his pals to be dealing in something simple like meth or maybe shabu, since they were so bold as to try dealing in the Twinkies territory. There were still drug deals in the South Side, but the dealers knew better than to deal to minors, especially around the Twinkies buildings. But Ricky had told him some newcomer was trying to entice him and his friends last night. So, like the good little enforcer he was, Dabby poked around and tracked one of the muscle-bound idiots to the warehouse the bozos were working out of. Then he went into the place to talk with them about staying in their own lane, maybe intimidate them so they wouldn't be so foolish as to try that shit again. What he didn't plan for was the group to be dealing in Trigger, or for them to shoot up and go bananas on him. Dabby had to scramble for a moment since he was wearing the quirk band that day and get it off before he could do any fighting. He was hit by the intensive heat of his quirk as soon as he did, but he had little choice with the 5 people out of their minds on drugs out for his blood. 2 of them were quickly dealt with as soon as he did, because one of them had speed-related quirk and he could trick them into running into each other, which had somehow ended up with him on top of a stack of crates with a massive gator man chomping at his feet and the other 2 heatedly arguing who got to eat his spleen. Because apparently Trigger was like every other drug and gave people weird cravings. Dabby would have used some fire by now to make the gator back off, but the wood crates and Trigger were very flammable, so he couldn't be using his quirk unnecessarily. So that was how Dabby ended up in this situation, and he didn't have much time to make a plan on what to do about the other 3. He was barely putting together a plan to try throwing a fireball when Gator Boy got the bright idea to swipe at the crate he was on. And because it was a cheap, old rotten crate, the damn thing was going to collapse in on itself with the big hole in it. What Big and Scaly wasn't expecting was the onslaught of Trigger to fall onto him after he busted open the box. Dabby took advantage of that to have a split second to jump off the dumbass's head and launch over the 2 cannibals, just barely missing the taller one's steel claws. Dabby's landing was far from graceful, and the only thing keeping him from breaking his nose along with the rest of his face was some quick thinking and sacrificing some skin on his arms. His wrist really hurt, but he could focus on that when he wasn't at risk of being turned into someone's dinner. And not wasting a second, Dabby got to his feet to run. "Ooh, he's running again!" the clown-faced exclaimed, running after him and laughing like a deranged hyena. "First to grab him gets to have his kidneys." The one with claws shouted, their claws making sparks as they dragged along the floor. And now that he had both of the crazies after him, it was the perfect time for Clownface to use their quirk and use one of the ribbons dangling from his arms to catch one of Dabby's legs, making him fall. "Motherfucker!" Dabby spat after his chin hit the concrete, only to have his body jerked around as another ribbon wrapped around one of his arms and began dragging him to the 2 salivating cannibals. Dabby tried to struggle, but the ribbon things were tougher than they looked, so he set his arm on fire to burn the damn thing, and was shocked when it didn't even quiver in the blue flames. But before Dabby could fully freak out about possibly being eaten alive by a psychotic clown, a roar from the Gator Boy bellowed through the warehouse. Then the gator barreled into the other 2, having grown even bigger with a dozen or so needles sticking out just from where Dabby could see. Suffering from an obvious drug overdose, Gator wasn't thinking as he attacked and tore apart his 2 companions. Dabby gulped and tried to back away from the carnage since the gator was too preoccupied tearing into the clown, but today the world had been very clear in its message of fuck you in particular as he bumped into one of the empty crates, creating a noise that was far too loud as Gator Boy's head snapped towards him. *Oh, fuck me. Dabby thought his entire body going rigid as the massive reptilian stared him down. The guy's body shaking from his ragged breathing coming out of his bloody maw. Time seemed to be frozen and Dabby felt a kind of terror he had once felt once before in his life flood his veins with an icy chill. What happened next happened far too fast for Dabby to consciously comprehend, and all he could remember was throwing one of his hands up before a bright light blinded him, while the muscles in said arm had him screaming from the pain. But the aftermath was clear. He was choking on the smoke and ash, violet fire leaping off every surface with shattered vials of trigger scattered along the charred ground. Dabby stumbled out of the fiery wreck of the building, clutching his right arm, only conscious because of the sharp feeling of pins and needles coming from the arm. He didn't make it far before he collapsed against some brick building as tears blurred his vision. He forced himself to sit up, and he tried to even out his breathing to something that wasn't considered hyperventilating. It took him a couple of seconds to realize his phone was ringing, and some part of his brain was surprised the cheap bugger had survived him going supernova. Dabby's uninjured hand managed to find the phone in one of his remaining pockets and answered whoever was calling him. Hey hun, you on your way home yet? Dabby choked up hearing Magni's voice on the other end, and she must have heard him. Kid, are you okay? Dabby? She questioned, becoming worried when he hadn't answered. Dabby tried to find his voice, but his vocal cords just wouldn't cooperate. Fuck. Red I see can't. He sobbed, unable to string any form of thought together as his brain began to warp where he was to back the training room when he confronted his sperm donor. It was the only other time he had felt this awful, and he barely survived it that time, so he felt this underlying panic that he wasn't going to make it thrumming through him. Hey kid, I'm going to get Midori-chan. Everything is going to be okay. Dabby, just stay on the line with me, okay? Magni told him, trying to keep her voice calm and steady to further assure him, and Dabby wanted to do just that because hearing her was the only thing keeping him from completely slipping back into the past. But he was growing weaker by the second, and he wouldn't be able to hold his head up for much longer, much less hold his phone up with how his arm was trembling. Red. Dabby croaked, spots obscuring his vision even more as his breathing slowed down. But his head didn't feel any less lightheaded and was hit by a wave of dizziness that caused him to fall over, and he couldn't hold onto the phone. Dabby. Dabby. Magni called, panicking, and Dabby wheezed back, trying to speak. He tried to stay awake, but he couldn't keep his grip on consciousness. Seconds later it all faded to black with Magni's voice. When Dabby was finally returned from the layer of unconsciousness, he came back to the feeling of his right arm being oddly numb with cold tingling throughout it and his head aching, not to mention his throat was burning. Dread welled up in him as he felt the familiar aftershock of abusing his quirk wreaking havoc on his body and the beeping from a heart monitor. Dabby desperately searched his mind for why he felt like this or where he was, but came up empty-handed as his memory refused to cooperate without making it too hard to think, much less open his eyes. And in his horrid state Dabby found himself consumed by the outlandish idea he had been found and that he would soon be forced back home. Tears welled up as he panicked over it, because even if the chances were extremely low, the mere idea had him completely distraught. He knew it was unforgivably selfish of him to have abandoned his siblings with Endeavor, but he would never go back to that house. After having gotten a small taste of what freedom was like, he would rather die than go back to that hell, even if he had to go back to living on the streets and searching through dumpsters for anything to eat. It was worlds better than staying in the same house as that man. If he was in a hospital, it would only be a matter of time before they matched his DNA to the missing persons report Fiume opened so long ago, and the sperm donor would find him. Dabby had to get out of here and find some way to contact Magni or even the Twinkie if it meant he wouldn't go back. A hollow groan was pulled from his lips as he tried to move, and he felt a sharp spike of pain being driven into him by his right arm from the attempt. A hand quickly went to his chest and made him keep still, and Dabby felt his breath be caught in his throat. "Don't move, Dabby. The painkillers are over the counter, so they're not that strong," Deku told him through the soft humming ringing in his ears. Normally Dabby would have felt a little annoyed hearing the Twinkie's voice in this state, but he was too busy drowning in relief that the boy was here. He and Deku weren't amicable, and he gave the kid a lot of grief, but the boy wouldn't let Endeavor take him. Deku blackmailing Magni's mom into leaving her alone was one of many things he'd done to protect the people he considered his. And Dabby had been working for Deku for a while now, so maybe he could talk the kid into using his less than legal connections to help him escape the hospital back to Magna's place. He'd do anything Deku wanted just to get him out of this situation. Deku, he said, ready to plead with the boy even if it felt like he swallowed glass, but he only stopped upon feeling a hand in his hair. Calm down, Dabby. You're not in a hospital and you're safe here with me, Deku assured, carefully running a hand through his hair, which was helping to keep his mind off the pain. Dabby felt all of his tension coming out of him upon knowing he didn't have to deal with his body protesting as he tried to escape. Without all the previous panic, his body could relax, and that helped the pain in his body lessen to a degree. Oh, his body was still giving him hell, but it wasn't as bad without the stress making him tense. Dabby took a moment to breathe and calmly enjoyed the feeling of someone's hand running through his hair like his mother used to do. Carefully, Dabby opened his eyes, trying not to move too much since his right arm hadn't taken to kindly to that before. He had to blink a couple of times to clear his vision and could see he was lying on a semi-familiar white bed in a mostly white room, which took him a minute to remember where he knew this place from. Deku had brought him back to the fireproof place he recovered from his cold at, and he supposed it made sense given he wasn't in the best of shape. Even if people in the south side were bending over backwards for him, Deku's resources weren't endless, and he'd use the same place when Dabby was unwell. His gaze trailed over to where Deku was standing beside the bed, a heart monitor and IV drip set up next to him. Thirsty, Deku guessed, holding up a bottle, and Dabby would have nodded if he could manage it without his arm throwing a fit over it, so he answered in the only way he could and grunted, "I'll take that as a yes. This has peppermint in it so that it might make your throat less grouchy with you," Deku commented, putting down the bottle. Deku then moved closer, and he helped Dabby to sit up somewhat with some pillows keeping him partially elevated before giving him any of the drink. And that hurt, but Dabby didn't say anything since he really wanted to drink something. In the right position, Dabby gladly drank from the bottle as soon as Deku held it up to his mouth. The water didn't fix his throat, but Dabby felt confident he could form words now. How'd I end up here? He questioned, still fuzzy on the details since his head was still being a dick and wasn't telling him shit about the truck that hit him last night. Magni-san texted me you needed help, so I tracked you down, which wasn't that hard since that warehouse you burned down was on the news, Deku explained with a small wave of the hand. Dabby frowned, trying to remember what the hell Deku was talking about, but the scraps he could recall didn't have anything to do with arson. He had gone to talk to some idiots about peddling their crap somewhere else than there. Dabby was hit by an intense wave of nausea as flashes of nearly blue-purple fire mixed with half-burnt bodies as well as splatters of red on concrete. Dabby began gagging as the memory of what charred bones smelt like made itself prominent at that moment. I killed them like him. Oh God, what the fuck have I done? I'm really just like him now, aren't I? How am I supposed to live with myself, knowing that I did? Dabby was ripped from his downward spiral by a hand cupping his cheek, and his eyes jumped to where Deku had moved to sit on the bed. Dabby, tell your brain to shut up for a second and listen to me, he instructed, lightly rubbing his cheek with his thumb. What happened a couple hours ago was awful, I won't deny that, and I wish there was a better way to have resolved this, but you didn't have a choice, did you, Dabby? Deku said, a sober element in his voice that he hadn't heard before. Dabby tried to look away from Deku, but the boy's hand kept him from fully turning away. I should have brought someone with me. Dabby shamefully spat, his left hand clenching the blanket, and things would have probably ended up the same way, and you'd being feeling even worse because you've hurt people you actually gave half of a fuck about, Dabby. Deku countered, then forcefully turned his head back. So they were looking at each other again. Dabby, I've only known you for 5 months, but I think I know you well enough to tell you here and now that despite what happened you, Dabby, are nothing like your father. Deku firmly told him. Dabby felt his heart drop like a stone into his stomach. What are you? Dabby sputtered, confusion and dread pooling in his guts, afraid of what kind answer the boy would give him, considering the kid always knew way more crap than he should. Todoroki Taoya, oldest of Todoroki Enji's 4 children. Quirk: cremation allows him to make blue flames hotter than 3000 C. Deku listed off as if it was the colors of the rainbow instead of the part of himself that he was desperately trying to bury in the past. He went missing and was declared dead back in April 65 after the training building on the Todoroki estate went up in flames. He would be 22 now, just like you, Dabby. Deku added, and Dabby knew exactly what he was hinting at, but the idea made his blood feel like ice. You knew? How? When did you? Dabby tried to question, but his shock wasn't doing his wrecked throat any favors. Deku gave him a raised eyebrow. Dabby, I knew who you were since day one. The only thing you've actively done to hide your identity is dyeing your hair. He said back, and Dabby wilted at that. Has anyone else found out who he was? Why hadn't anyone said anything to him about it if they knew? But if you knew who I was, why the hell would you hire me? Or let me around your people knowing that I was related to that bastard? He rasped, unable to see how Deku could have thought that any part of hiring him was a good idea in any context. Dabby, I don't care if you're related to Endeavor. And as I just said, you are nothing like that man. I work with people I know aren't quite legal. Yuri-san is probably like the biggest example of the fact I do not give a fuck about what you did in the past or what you're doing now. Deku firmly told him. And yeah, Dabby did know Deku was pretty cozy with some shady people, and that Yuri guy practically doted on Deku in a way Dabby couldn't help being envious of. But his brain was having a hard time translating that into letting the kid of the jackass who fucked your lives up be my rent-a-cop, because that seemed a pretty big leap to make. Why wouldn't you turn me in for the money? He questioned, especially since he damn well knew Endeavor would pay hand over fist in hush money if Deku brought him back home from the beginning. Deku hummed, I could've, but I'd never do that. The boy responded, why? Dabby hissed, and Deku's eyes softened a bit. Did you know there's an odd pattern in that scar on your neck? It looks like a hand that would have been 21 centimeters long, the same size as Endeavor's hand. Deku said back, and Dabby's heart dropped even further. Deku's hands pulled back and he crossed his arms, turning away slightly. That's not much of a reason until you remember how tight-lipped Endeavor has always been about his family, which isn't odd for a limelight hero per se, but what little I could find paints a very specific picture about what goes on behind closed doors. Deku admitted, and Dabby didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Because of course Deku would know about his family being a complete garbage fire. The fucker was just a magic 8-ball for knowledge he shouldn't know. Why wouldn't Deku know about his sperm donor was just as much of a bastard at home as he was in general? And now he had something else in common with his old man. Having killed others with his quirk, he was just one tortured family away from becoming just like the bastard. As if hearing his thoughts, Deku suddenly whacked him on the back of the head. Dabby, you will never be defined by that man's actions, so don't compare yourself to him just because you happen to share blood or a quirk. And I will never hate you unless you do something that I can't justify, like butchering kittens for the heck of it or becoming a serial killer. Deku said, apparently having trouble coming up with something deemed unforgivable in his eyes. That is, a low-ass bar Twinkie. Dabby couldn't help saying, because that was like the bare minimum requirement. And he got a soft snort in return. Well, I'm a two-toes. What do you expect? Deku said in a way that felt like it was some inside joke he was supposed to be in on, but Dabby had no clue what that meant. Magni had tried to look up what exactly a two-toes was, but her search results just got her a bunch of things about feet, and neither of them could understand how that played into what Deku said after chasing out Magni's mom. And after learning that Deku basically knew his whole life story, Dabby wanted to have something on the little twerp. What the fuck does that mean? What's a two toes? He questioned. Deku blinked, seemingly taken aback, before a spark of understanding flashed through his eyes, and he rubbed the back of his neck. Ah, sorry Dabby. I thought you would have heard the term before, given how long you were on the streets. Two toes is the preferred term for quirkless people like me. Deku explained a bit awkwardly. Dabby's brain seemed to crash upon hearing that, and all he could manage was a small "eh?" Because how could this kid be genuinely quirkless and scare the living hell out of people? Was it all just because of his connections to powerful people like Yuri? And what about that damn death aura that always surrounded him whenever he got royally pissed off? Deku laughed awkwardly. Yeah, I tend to get that a lot. I don't know why everyone thinks I have an intelligence quirk. I mean, I only wear primordial shoes. You'd think people would catch on, right? Deku told him, pointing at the rather iconic shoes he always wore, and Dabby kind of understood that point. It was a tightly kept secret, but his little brother Natsuo was quirkless, and Dabby remembered his brother needed different shoes that had to be made just for him. Something about a joint in his brother's pinky toes making the bone structure different, and he needed different shoes because of that. And Endeavor made sure they mimicked common brands instead of ordering the cheaper ones online. But that still left him questioning how Deku could put the fear of God into anyone. Sure, that weird aura thing was intimidating, but he knew you couldn't make it through the real world with just talk, so there had to be something else under that, maybe mob mentality and peer pressure. Deku had more than enough friends to make him someone you didn't want to fuck with on a good day, and he didn't have enough fingers to count just the groups he knew of that would pounce on anyone that dared to threaten the greenette. Sort of like that old mad thing Deku talked about where everyone with nukes agreed to not end the world. Except it was an unspoken rule of not pissing off Deku unless they wanted to become enemy number one. Dabby, Deku called, bringing him out of his thoughts. You hurt yourself pretty bad with your quirk. We tried to save as much of the skin we could, but there wasn't much we could do with how burnt your arm was. Deku explained, switching topics abruptly and seriously. Dabby's eyes went to where his right arm was and saw it was entirely wrapped in thick white bandages from the shoulder down, except for a small part where an IV drip was. Damn, did I burn the skin off or something? Dabby asked, half serious, and was not reassured when Deku didn't reply right away. In some places, yes, we had to remove a lot of the tissue to prevent necrosis with how bad the burns were. Yuri-san had someone with a quirk that mediated some of that damage, but a good portion of your arm will have the muscle exposed. Deku somberly explained, unwinding the bandages and painfully revealing the tender flesh underneath, making Dabby hiss. The old dark violet-colored scar that took up half of his forearm was now replaced with a mix of porous-looking white scars mixed with charred black seams that ran along dark red muscle tissue. Dabby's stomach turned at the sight, and he wondered how much of his arm now looked like this. Due to the damage, you'll need to spend some time relearning what things feel like and how to move your arm since you lost almost all of the nerves there. Deku explained as he began to treat the burned forearm with a swab. Dabby winced, expecting a sting or some kind of pain, but he hardly felt anything. He hardly felt the pressure from the wipes being pressed to his arm. I'll still pay you while you're recovering, Dabby, but this can't happen again. Deku said, his hand trembling a bit as he got ready to rewrap his arm. Glancing down at his arm, Dabby couldn't help agreeing. And as painful as it was to admit to himself, he needed someone to help him get his quirk under control before it actually killed him, and he only had one option available to him. Is that quirk training deal still on the table? Dabby forced himself to inquire. Deku's head shot up. His eyes fluttered, mouth opening and closing. Why, yes, the boy answered, eyes brimming with trepidation, and Dabby forced himself to swallow his pride so that he could ask, then will you help me with my quirk? Deku's eyes widened, and the boy had to take a deep breath so he could calmly answer, of course I will, Dabby. I've already got a step-by-step plan made for you, so you can work on your own. Since I can only be here 2 days a week, I'll need to make changes since you're not in the best condition. But they'll be minor, and I can include some exercises that can help your recovery, Deku said, devolving into muttering as he wrapped Dabby's arm up again. Dabby wanted to stay awake, but he was still exhausted, and with the soft muttering floating around him, it was impossible for him not to fall back asleep. Self-reflection was something that came hard to Mitsuki, and she couldn't blame anyone else for it, mainly because she could own up to it when she fucked up, but accountability didn't make her feel any less like a guilty fuck-up. And that was never clearer than when Inkai broke the news to her about her son. She had spent a couple of days just trying to figure out how she could have missed her son's behavior when they were in the same house, and she eventually had to swallow the fact that she just wasn't close to her son in any meaningful matter. Something she had to beat herself up over, because how does such a major disconnect happen under your nose when you live in the same house and see each other nearly every day, much less one you don't even realize is happening? And there was little she could do to fix it after the fact, because she was an emotional mess who was likely to do something horrible if she stewed on what Katsuki did. She couldn't even look at Katsuki for months without shame and anger welling up under her skin, which only made her more pissed with herself because she should be an adult and help Masaru with setting their son straight. Because nearly 2 decades ago she was the very same, and Inkai had suffered a lot of grief to help her be a respectable member of society. And knowing Katsuki was only doing all this crap because he was trying to help only made her angrier with herself, being unable to control her emotions so she could comfort Katsuki. Once she did manage to put a lid on her anger, she had her work cut out for her trying to build a relationship with Katsuki from the ground up, which was considerably harder after giving him the cold shoulder for nearly a year. Finding common ground was hard as she quickly realized they didn't share any interests. And it wasn't for lack of trying to find out Katsuki's hobbies, but because her son's life had previously revolved solely around training for his dream future in heroics. It had gotten better since Katsuki started doing pottery, but her son still didn't have much going on in his life other than preparing for heroics. Something she knew couldn't stand because her son needed something to help him separate himself from his work, so Mitsuki tried to find something he might enjoy. It took some time, but she eventually found something, and on the plus side, it was an activity the two of them could do together. Hiking was something she had picked up back in middle school, and she had enjoyed for years now at this point. Katsuki had been tense for the entire time, the first time she had dragged him along with her. The fact that he expected her to do something to him once they were alone greatly disheartened her, but was something she wouldn't blame him for the feeling after everything that had gone down. Katsuki wasn't completely at ease going out for these hikes for the first few trips, and it was admittedly awkward since the two of them still weren't quite talking yet. Even though Katsuki was getting better at talking with them, it was clear that he was avoiding going to her about things and mostly went to Masaru. She had bit her tongue on the matter, knowing that she shouldn't force him to come to her. But Mitsuki could tell there was still an underlying tension that was keeping her from really connecting with Katsuki, and that if she wanted to get through to her son, and that she'd need to do something to address it before it festered into something neither of them could handle. So Mitsuki probably spent just a little too much time trying to give herself a pep talk and tried to make herself as calm as she could be, since she knew this time her emotions were going to run high. Which is why she chose a day Masaru would be home all day and forced a satellite phone onto him, and would be giving one to Katsuki when they headed out just case she did lose it. She wasn't expecting to, but with her anger issues, it was better to not risk it. She knocked on Katsuki's door. "Oi brat, you ready to go?" she called, already dressed and ready to go. She could hear the shuffling on the other side of the doorstop. "Just give me a second," he said after a long pause, and she deflated a bit hearing the considerably respectful reply. Maybe it could be seen as disrespectful, but she enjoyed the sharp and snappy comebacks she always got from her son before. Katsuki opened the door after a few moments and silently followed her to the car and sat in the front seat leaning against the car door. Mitsuki sighed, but didn't mention how he was walking on eggshells, and just drove the car to their destination, Sekaibe. There weren't any official trails there, but if anything, that would probably excite her son given how often he and Izuku would get lost in the woods nearby. The area was a bit more dangerous than most people would consider for off-trail hiking, but she had been traveling to different points on Sekai since she was 16, so she felt safe enough to lead Katsuki around the place. Sekai held a very important place in her heart, and she often came here during tough times in her life, and she'd need the comfort of the area to keep herself in check and help her talk with her son the way she knew needed to do. With the car parked, she and Katsuki waited for the cars on the highway to stop, and they began to climb the rough terrain. This was the first time Katsuki was climbing an uncleared path, and she could tell he was enjoying the increased difficulty of the whole thing much more. At some point, Katsuki took the lead from her, and she was following his for a while. After a couple of minutes, Mitsuki got them back on track and led Katsuki to the spot she had carved out for herself on Sekai. The spot was noticeably more developed than the rest of the area given she had cleared a small bit of the place so it could be a bit more hospitable rest spot given how much she came to visit here over the years. Katsuki got the hint they were taking a break and sat himself down by the cliff face ledge and began drinking from one of his water bottles while staring at the ocean. Knowing that this was probably the best time to have this conversation, and took a big swig from her massive water bottle in an attempt to swallow her nerves. Then Mitsuki walked over and sat beside Katsuki, something that made him flinch, and she could see the hairs on the back of his neck were raised. She tried to meet his eyes, but he wouldn't raise his head, and she sighed, also turning her gaze to the ocean. Taking a moment to consider how things were between them right now, Mitsuki considered that starting this indirectly might be best. "Have I ever told you how Inkai and I met?" she asked, catching the boy off guard. "No," Katsuki replied, and she could basically feel his confusion. Mitsuki closed her eyes, digging the nails of one hand into her arm to keep herself grounded. "We first met back during high school," Mitsuki told him. "Eh? I thought you and Auntie have been friends since diapers." Katsuki said, surprised, and she scoffed. "I fucking wish we were. I wouldn't be nearly as fucked up as I am if I did have Inkai around to be my big sister," she responded. She had thought about all the regrets she wouldn't have if Inkai had been by her side from the start, and she made up plenty of bittersweet fantasies of what her life could have been with Inkai as her sister. "Inkai is 2 years older than me, and she only moved to the area I grew up in after middle school, so we couldn't have met before that," Mitsuki briefly explained before getting back on topic. "I wasn't the best person back then. Katsuki and Inkai put up with way too much of my crap. I still have no idea what the hell she saw in me back then that made her think I was worth keeping around," she said, her eyes guiltily falling to her lap. "What?" he quietly asked, and Mitsuki chuckled, letting her head hang. "It's ridiculous how people can't see past first appearances. I know you've only known me as your mom, someone confident with their shit mostly together and a successful business with a shit ton of connections, and there ain't any reason for you to think otherwise." She mused, the smile she forced onto her face not reaching her eyes. "But back when I was your age, I was a fucking nightmare of a child. I wasn't on any meds, and I didn't have any way to control or vent my anger, so I lashed out at everyone. One second I could be sitting class, and the next I could be throwing a massive hissy fit and throwing chairs at people," she elaborated, and glancing at Katsuki, she saw he was looking back at her with wide eyes. "Back then the kids I grew up with just knew me as Little Mad Dog Mitzi, the sweaty rabid bitch that was constantly losing her shit and would beat you bloody if you looked at her wrong. And they weren't wrong. At that time in my life I was so stressed that anything could set me off, and I usually got violent during those fits," she admitted. Her childhood was chock full of painful memories of her doing things horribly because of her uncontrollable anger. Mitsuki forced herself to breathe evenly as one figure kept popping up in her mind. "And there was one girl who'd taken advantage of that. I knew her since I was 6, and she used my issues to egg me on, then would make it look like I was the one bullying her, and given my track record no would ever believe me. The violet girl with a stupid quirk that made her sweaty all the time, over the girl that looked and acted like a damn angel," She told him, hugging herself as for the first time in years she let herself remember. Ashley. The girl had made her life hell and did it all with an innocent smile because her quirk always made her look like a flawless angel. But Ashley was incredibly sadistic, and she reveled in all the attention she got whenever she got Mitsuki in trouble. And when we got to high school, I thought nothing was ever going to change. That bitch got me cornered on the first day, and when I lost my shit, she cried to some second years who forced me into the girls' bathroom to teach me a lesson, which was how I met Inkai, having my head dunked in the toilets. Mitsuki said morosely because as great as it was she met Inkai, she would never look at a public restroom without gagging. I didn't really know her at the time, and with how meek she was, I just expected her to buy into the two-faced whore story and not to do anything about it, but she didn't. Mitsuki scoffed, shaking her head, then gave Katsuki a sly grin. "Ya know what she did do?" she prompted, and he shook his head after a second. Mitsuki smirked. She ripped out the brat's two front teeth with her quirk, then grabbed me when everyone was panicking, and we hightailed it. She explained and laughed when Katsuki's mouth fell open from his shocking. "Auntie did what?" he exclaimed. Teeth count as a small object, so Inkai just had to pull a bit harder to rip 'em out, but she wasn't planning on doing it, so she was freaking out about it as much as the girl she ripped the teeth out of. I actually had to calm her ass down because she was bawling over it. Mitsuki replied and huffing with small smile, as she was sure the two of them were quite the image. "Did the two of you get in trouble?" Katsuki pressed. "For once in my life, no. Inkai was just as much of a jellyfish back then, and the teacher's pet to boot, so she just had to keep bawling, and no one could believe she'd ever do that. And after that the two of us were kind of inseparable because she just kind of clung to my side despite my personality being mostly garbage at that point." Mitsuki said fondly, looking back at that time, though she wished she would have appreciated it for what it was. It wasn't long after she graduated and was getting ready for college, since she was in her third year, and I was thrown out of the house by my parents. She told him, causing Katsuki's eyes to widen. "They did?" he asked, and she wasn't surprised. She had never really told him anything about her parents due to their strained relationship. Neither of them had Ed like us. Whenever I did anything, it was always my fault. I couldn't control myself, and they made me feel like there was something seriously wrong with me because everyone gets angry. Deal with it like a normal person, was something they constantly told me for years whenever I snapped, and they never said it to my face, but I know they said they couldn't understand why I couldn't be a normal child. Mitsuki explained, digging her nails deeper into her arm to distract her mind from her old memories. And after 16 years of dealing with me, admittedly being a nightmare child after another fit, they decided they wouldn't put up with me anymore and disowned me. I barely had time to pack a bag before I was on the streets alone, and I tried to make the best it for the first few days. She elaborated, shocking her son. He likely would have never believed she was homeless if she hadn't been the one to tell him. Those days weren't quite her worst, since she had been lucky to have enough yen to eat one meal a day, and some snacks from the spare yen she found. Even if she spent the rainiest time of the year in a park, I wasn't homeless for long, maybe 3 days before Inkai found me in a gas station and forced me to stay with her. Even though she was busy with medical college and working her ass off to afford it, she refused to leave me without a roof over my head. Mitsuki said, grimacing as she thought of that partially rocky point in their friendship. It wasn't smooth sailing for us during that point. I was a dropout working a crappy job so the two of us could make ends meet and didn't have anything going for me. My head was pretty fucked up at that point, so it was only a matter of time before I had a blackout when I was staying with Inkai. She had dealt with my fits before and didn't complain when I trashed her apartment, but I really fucking lost it this time. She told him, letting her head hang as that night returned to the forefront of her mind. When I came to, there was a lot of broken glass, and I had broken Inkai's arm in 3 places. I've hurt people before, but this time was different. Inkai had done so much for me and has put up with me and all of my shit, and how the hell do I repay her? By breaking her arm and destroying her chances in getting the career she always dreamed about before it could even start. I couldn't handle it," she confessed, tears angrily pricking at the corners of her eyes. Katsuki sat in shocked silence, staring at her in disbelief, so after counting down from 10, she continued her retelling. "So I ran away. I wandered around for a bit before I found a mountain, and in that state, I thought it was best if a stupid bitch like me just to disappear, so I just started climbing until I was too tired to move. I was in a pretty dark place then, sitting on some mountain in the middle of the night, having dragged myself through the underbrush and wondering why the fuck I was such a fucking screw-up and just what the fuck was wrong with me." Mitsuki admitted, her eyes going to the tree she had broken her hand on. Because dumb hormonal teenage her thought that was the best thing to do at that moment of self-loathing. Then she scoffed, "And I don't know how, but somehow Inkai tracked my ass down in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere just to bust my balls for running off like that and making her worry even though I fucked up her arm. She didn't even go to a hospital first. I mean, her first thought after that shitstorm I caused was to find me and make sure I was safe." Mitsuki spat, still in disbelief by the audacity of the greenette's mind sometimes. I told her she was a complete fucking moron, but she didn't care because she said she knew I needed someone to be there for me, and she kept trying to tell me she didn't blame me for what I'd done to her because she understood that my brain was screwed up. That was first time that had ever happened since I was, 3. It was a real kick to the head when I realized that in 1 year Inkai gave more of a fuck about me than either of my parents ever did. Mitsuki commented with a hollow chuckle, rubbing her eyes. She eventually talked me into coming back, and after that night she pushed to get me the help I needed. She talked to a bunch of the people in the psychological courses to find someone for me to go to. And that's how I ended up going to the guy I've been seeing. Inkai even paid for all the drugs trails I had to go through before I found the meds I needed," Mitsuki explained, her hand falling from her arm. "During that time, I got scouted and Inkai encouraged me to do it since she knew I took a liking to makeup when my head was settling down. And after my debut in the fashion world, everything just seemed to be going uphill until sometime after I turned 18 and was doing a big interview on a talk show." She couldn't help scowling as she thought back to that moment and wished she was more confident and had the backbone she did now. The idiotic host was fed some sob story about how we got separated by my parents and they appeared halfway through for us to reunite. I should have been happy to hear them say all the things I always wanted to hear, but I didn't want them anywhere near me, but I couldn't move. Then like a damn Valkyrie, Inkai stomped out from backstage and slapped my mom before telling them both, since they were clearly just there because I had money and fame now. She recalled, grinning when she remembered she had the moment saved on her phone. Mitsuki exhaled, leaning back a bit. "That's just a short list of shit Inkai and I went through. And each time something happened, I knew I could always fall back on and trust Inkai to be there to support me or give me a kick to the teeth when I needed it, because for a long-ass time, she was the only family I had." She concluded, looking up at the sky, then turned to Katsuki. "Do you know why I'm telling you this crap?" she asked, and he swiftly looked away from her. She took that as a no. "Because I want you to know I'm not blowing smoke up your ass when I say I understand how it feels to have royally fucked up, and that you can one day make up for it and move past it," Mitsuki told him and leaned forward with her elbows resting on her legs. "I know I didn't react the best after all the bullshit between you and Izuku came out, and that I probably can't give you the same kind of support Inkai gave me, but I want to try, Katsuki," she said, reaching deep into whatever part of her she could to try and explain to him properly. "You fucked up, majorly, but you're still my son. I'll always love you and I want to help you through this clusterfuck just like how Inkai helped me, because I know this might be the worst point of your life," Mitsuki told him hesitantly, bringing her hand up to ruffle Katsuki's hair. He flinched but didn't pull away, but she noticed his hands were shaking. Making a bold move, Mitsuki wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders and pulled him to lean against her. "I am complete dogshit with all this emotional stuff, brat. There's a reason I normally leave this for your dad and Inkai to deal with. And I don't know if this will make you feel better, but I want you to know you're not as mentally screwed up as you think you are." Mitsuki said, hoping she hadn't screwed up in her attempt to connect with Katsuki. The only emotional shit from other people she was actually experienced to handle was when Inkai was crying solely because she's dealt with it so much. They did live together for nearly 7 years, so it would be impossible for her not to know. On the plus side, Mitsuki knew how to save carpet from being irreparably water damaged, which was more helpful knowledge than it had any right to be. Asterisk fucking hell, why couldn't I have picked up on any of that empathy Inkai's dripping in after all these years? Mitsuki thought, feeling sort of stupid and about to let go of Katsuki when he suddenly pressed against her harder with a tisk, cram it with the emo crap. Auntie is supposed to be the one who's blubbering about the past, you old hag. Katsuki spat, though it was a bit forced compared to his normal quipping. But that wasn't the point, because she knew he was trying to reach out to her. And she scoffed, "Oi, I'm trying to have a fucking moment with you, you ungrateful brat." She replied, squeezing him closer, and Katsuki crossed his arms with a huff, not making any move to pull away from her, and she smiled, happy to have made some groundwork with her son and planned to keep up the good work by building on this. Already making plans for more hiking trips where he wouldn't have to worry about being so open. And who knows, maybe he can get rid of some of his stress through some good old-fashioned scream therapy. Mountains were great for screaming out your feelings without the cops being called, in her experience. Shota groaned as he woke up to his phone giving him a headache from the ringtone Hisashi made just for him. Even after all these years, the blonde was still waking him up at the crack of dawn like in high school. Well, the clock said midnight, but that was hardly the point. Shota gave half a thought to just rolling out of bed and crawling to the bathroom, but knew that would be more trouble than it was worth. Grumbling, Shota got to his feet and crept to his attached bathroom, then stripping down for an ice-cold shower. It was a hell of a wake-up call, and Shota wasn't even surprised when he found things that would normally be concerning trapped in his hair. Like a human tooth, it wasn't something he always found in his hair. But he didn't always fight villains who could shoot out their teeth like a weapon. Yesterday's patrol was exhausting since he had to cover for Scripture since she had something come up with her baby. He couldn't blame her though, since her baby had to go to the hospital. Cleaned up, Shota stumbled out in a towel to grab his hero costume from the dryer and threw it on before moving to the kitchen, about to turn on the coffee maker, but it cut him off with a sharp ding. Looking at the machine, he saw his thermos already ready to be filled and the machine loaded with his favorite coffee grounds, and he sighed fondly. Hisashi must have worked overtime yesterday if the blonde got the coffee machine up and running for him in time. Hisashi worked as a teacher, a radio host, and a pro-limelight hero 6 days a week, and he had the gall to call Shota a workaholic when he had a 96-hour work week compared to his 90-hour work week. Shota genuinely had no idea where Hisashi found the time to do his grading and get enough sleep to not keel over midday, much less do little things like this for him. Shota was grateful for it, though, as he had a bit more on his plate since last October. Nezu had held the active heroes on staff back for small meeting about a minor concern of his * minor concern my ass. Shota mentally scoffed at that last thought as he took his first sip of coffee. Perhaps it was a bit presumptuous of him, but Shota had known Nezu for a long time. He was a first year when Nezu had taken office as principal, and he knew Nezu has kept a closer eye on him compared to most of the students. Something about him being in the 10% or something when he got up the nerve to ask why he forced the school board to accept his decision to transfer Shota to the hero course. So, Shota liked to think that even if he couldn't fully understand the mammal's methodology, he could read between the lines Nezu gave everyone. Nezu was an adaptable actor that constantly played to the expectations people had of him, and Shota had picked up on more than a few of Nezu's behaviors so he could deal with people, likely as the mammal wanted. One of the things Shota did know about Nezu was that he never called a meeting over minor issues, so Shota made sure to listen to what Nezu was really saying, which was that there was a new info broker that was making the kind of ripples that he had taken notice of them. Something that didn't happen often given how rarely villains stray from convention. And probably being one of the few to do so, Shota began looking into this mysterious Deku-Sensei and whatever he could find on them. which might be the most frustrating thing that he's done to date because he hasn't found diddly squat in concrete info on the broker. Most of what he found lined up with what Nezu had told them in the meeting. Deku-Sensei was likely a dealer in information, and he had info that appealed to any demographic in the underworld given he was so spread out, and that he could even help with quirks if the theory Nezu had was accurate. Nezu was also correct in that Deku-Sensei had serious ties to high-up people that were dangerous given the way people were so tip-lipped about everything surrounding Deku-Sensei. It had overall left Shota uneasy given how much of a newcomer he was to the underground racket from what Nezu said. Shota was starting to think that it might perhaps be quirk-related. An NDA deal sort of quirk that forced the two parties into an agreed silence of the transaction as one of the conditions or face an agreed-upon consequence. Shota had forwarded the theory onto Nezu since it was the only thing of substance to contribute to the mammal's investigation before he passed out for the night. Given how widespread but tightly controlled Deku-Sensei was with his information, Shota was quickly learning to understand why Nezu had brought up his concerns about him all those months ago. Hopefully Nezu and Isamu could find something big enough to get an official investigation up and running. And maybe if it was just that, Shota wouldn't be so stressed out, but no, life would never be so kind to Shota as let him off that easy and just give him one headache to deal with. Because that damn problem child was still out there and probably laughing it up as he ran circles around Shota for the last few months. If he wasn't convinced before when he first stopped the boy, then Shota was sure that whoever the brat was, he must have had some kind of mind control compulsion quirk that made people do what he said. Because almost every week near the end of his patrol, the problem child would pop up at a fight or a drug deal gone wrong to shout at the involved parties to cut it out, which they bafflingly would. And while Shota's body was fine with not fighting off a gang or two, Shota was miffed that each time when he tried to follow the problem child to give him a talk about vigilantism, the brat would give him the slip. Looking past the fact that the brat was clearly doing this on purpose at this point to fuck with him, he would be the first to offer the kid the resources to apply for the hero course, if he wasn't old enough to enter yet. The way the kid resolved these incidents with little to no effort, with minor injury and almost no casualties, was enviably quirk or no. And the kid's skills at getting away from a veteran undergrounder like himself only made Shota want the kid under his wing more. Asterisk, huh? Maybe this is what Nezu meant about me being an oddity that he couldn't let go. Shota mused before he went out for the beginning of his patrol by climbing out the window, only to stop and curse himself when he forgot to grab his phone and went back inside for it, being quiet about it even if Hizashi was likely to have turned off his implants for the night. Later, when Shota walked into the teacher's lounge, he was soaked to the bone and scowling while counting down from 10 and reminding himself that problem child was a minor. About an hour ago, there was another turf war in Yezu's red light district. Something that Shota expected to happen fairly often given the countless gangs and other criminal groups that used Yezu as social hub of sorts for doing business. He had been warned against patrolling there when he graduated because of that. But that was why Shota was trying to get a route there. All his years with Nezu had taught him how vital it was to keep a wide and expansive information network, and Yezu was basically ground zero for knowing interpersonal connections between the underground. But as had become common, the problem child had rocked up to put everyone in their places, and when Shota had tried to catch the boy, he had misstepped, falling off the rooftop. Absolutely his mistake, given he should have known better than to trust the weather report and been more careful once he realized it had rained, but hindsight was 20/20 and all that. He had saved himself from cracking his skull open on the concrete, but the gang that was still there had noticed his last-minute save, and he had ended up having to brawl it out with 5 of the 10 members, then drag them off to the nearest police station. One of the said members had a rainfall quirk, and was the reason he was in little better mood than recently bathed cat. And per usually for these encounters, the problem child would disappear in the middle of the chaos, and with 5 criminals he couldn't leave them to pursue the problem child. So Shota was in a rather sour mood, and the rest of the staff in the room could see it, considering how Majima and Baki had given him a wide berth as he walked into the room. Unfortunately for him, Hisashi and Nimuri were in the break room and have spotted him, and Shota wouldn't be able to get away from them anytime soon. Especially once they got a good look at his sorry state. "Oh Tilda, will you look what the cat dragged in?" Nimuri cooed, walking up to him with a cocky sway of her hips before throwing her arm over his shoulder and leaning against him. "Did ya have secret rendezvous with your new kitten show?" she teased, and Shota took a deep breath, letting his head hang. "How many times do I have to say that the problem child is not anything but a pain in my ass?" he hissed through gritted teeth. "But you did have a run-in with the little listener, right?" Hisashi inquired, coming over with cup of coffee, which was the sole reason Shota didn't snap at him. Shifting his balance, Nimuri stumbled forward, and she was quick to correct it while Shota took the offered coffee and downed it, letting it warm his bones before rolling his shoulders. "Yes," he flatly answered, moving over to the cabinet, knowing it had some spare towels Nezu kept for in case of accidents. "Oh, what did the little listener use this time? Math? History?" Hisashi pressed, and Shota regretted telling them about the problem child, since both of his friends haven't gotten way too much enjoyment hearing about the boy's continuing vigilantism. "Maybe something a bit spicier like biology?" Nimuri purred, leaning against Hisashi instead. Shota froze and released a large sigh. "English," he admitted, fully braced for Hisashi's overjoyed squeal that rattled the windows from the blonde's pitch. Deciding he didn't have the mental stability to deal with either of his friends today, Shota turned on his heel, fully intending to clean up during lunch after Hisashi was done gushing, ignoring Hisashi's excited babbled questions about what part of English the boy used. Entering the classroom, Shota found that his remaining 13 students in their chairs awaiting him, and Shota was a tiny bit relieved that his homeroom class was mildly more behaved than the average bunch of high schoolers he received. He could see from their faces some of them were questioning his appearance, but Shota brushed that aside to get to the point of today's homeroom and internally groaned, "It's time to prepare yourselves," he announced, and a good chunk of his students looked uneasy as he waited a few seconds before continuing. "The sports festival is approaching fast, and the time you have to train is limited, so you should take this time seriously. Depending on the branch of heroics you wish to pursue, this could be vital in your future career," he informed them, causing a few of them to look excited, and quite predictably Amajiki became pale. For the rest of the period, Shota outlined the expectations of them for the festival and school resources that they could take advantage of for training, since this would be their first festival. Only 3 of his students not seeming overly excited by the end of the period, but he expected as much. Amajiki seemed to be constantly fumbling through his anxiety over one thing or another, so this international event would obviously stress the boy out more than normal. Miyake never reacted in any major fashion aside from when he stepped in to defuse a situation, and Shota rightfully didn't think this time would be different. And Minta, who did look a little eager but also anxious, which was different from what he expected from Minta, since the boy was usually so apathetic. It must have had something to do with whatever Miyake did to cause a change in the boy's behavior. Minta wasn't originally a part of Miyake's friend group, but had started tagging along after last weekend. Those 3 boys combined with Hato and Haya, and that Tagata from 1B made a friend group that was as familiar as it was bizarre. Hato and Tagata were as loud and cheerful as Hisashi was during their time in UA. He could see shades of himself in Miyake. Minta and Haya were sassy enough to be an early Nimuri, but he didn't think he could map Amajiki to any of their friends in the coming years. There were other friend groups in his class, but they stuck out the most due to nostalgia. But it was probably because their group was surprisingly the most responsible. Given his quirk, Nezu normally sacked him with the more troublesome students, since he'd do a far better job whipping them into shape than Can. So Shota's well-behaved students were far and few, which made them even more memorable. Feeling his phone vibrating against his leg for what had to be the 16th time, Shota mentally grimaced and found himself wishing not for the first time that his friends could just grow up already. He knew toddlers that were more behaved than them. Madison sighed as she was awoken by the overwhelming feelings of others leaking in through the thin walls. Getting up, she shuffled into her bathroom to get ready for the day and put on her uniform. On her way out of the complex, she caught the hint of self-loathing from one of her neighbors and paused outside their apartment. Upon hearing the sound of them getting ready to leave, she quickly ran back around the corner and then waited for the door to open before walking out as if for the first time. "Oh, good morning, Ren-san." She greeted the willowy owl figure. Ren's head turned on a swivel to her, and they greeted her in return with a soft coo, the cloud of self-loathing loosening its hold over them. Madison knew that this kind of thing wasn't much in the eyes of most, but she knew these little interactions helped lighten people's emotional load more often than not. And the brief chat she had with Ren had left the avian with a bit of a spring in their step. With an empath quirk like hers, it was impossible not to notice. Being able to know how people were feeling through her five senses might be a nice quirk if she could turn it off for even a few seconds, but she supposed that it was the trade-off for it being so accurate in how others were feeling. It was near impossible to explain her quirk, so she often had to dumb it down when she did try to warn people about something. For most empaths, she understood they needed time to figure out what each emotion was, but every feeling was so visceral for her that she knew instinctively what a good emotion was and what were the bad ones. It was a problem when she was a toddler because she would point to anyone that had a bad impression and say they were evil. The worst time was when she was 8 and met the math substitute teacher and she yelled he was a child predator. The man was indeed a pedophile. But she faced a lot of criticism because empath quirks aren't that accurate. And it wasn't like she could explain how she felt the difference in emotions since it wasn't like she could just point to a metaphor. It just wasn't that simple, like knowing what color the sky was by looking up. It was a complex mix of all five senses that left a very specific impression on her that her brain could process almost immediately. Her parents were sympathetic to her plight and tried to keep her from too much human exposure so she could have time to recuperate. But a car accident had left her alone years ago. The foster system wasn't kind to her in the 2 years she was in it before running away. Living in the South Side wasn't quite the best since the people here always seemed to be struggling in some way. Saying that it bred negativity and misery was an understatement. But she could feel the people themselves weren't that bad deep down under all the layers of hate and grief or whatever emotions they were feeling. And the few people that were dangerous were easy enough to find since their toxicity was clear as day to her and she could avoid them with little trouble. That was one of the few things that kept her alive since she has been on her own despite being in the arguably most dangerous area in Japan. Her quirk was both a blessing and a curse in that way. The worst thing about her quirk was when she met someone that her quirk told her needed to be saved. The first time she met someone like that was a woman that threw herself in front of a train. She was 3 at the time, and she has met many people caught in that same thick miasma of near death as that woman, and despite her best attempts, she rarely could talk them out of whatever they planned. Even though she only saved 1 or 2 people from themselves, she still tried, even if the failures never left her consciousness, but at some point, she knew that some people just couldn't be saved from their self-destructive mindsets that dug them deeper into their negativity. Well, that was what she thought before she met Deku-Sensei. Deku-Sensei's emotions were an odd but not unfamiliar cocktail of self-loathing, anxiety, desperation, and a speck of hope she had come to associate with 2 toes, though she was surprised by the minor amount of suicidal and self-harming compulsions since 2 toes usually had those things in spades at Deku-Sensei's age. But the thing that surprised her was his impact on the people around him. Calling the way he changed the people around him the butterfly effect wasn't a close enough parable. What he did was so much more than that. In the end, she started calling what happened the Deku principle. Through exposure to the individual known as Deku-Sensei can cause acute changes to the affected party. The degree of the changes was determined by the amount of contact between the two, which is especially effective with multiple meetings over a longer period. With her quirk, she could see it work firsthand as Deku-Sensei basically sucked the misery out of someone by just being around them. It wasn't obvious at first because of how minute the changes were in the people, But the ripples started to be noticeable, changes that didn't dissipate even when Deku-Sensei wasn't around the way such changes in mindset usually would when the cause was gone. Dabby was the biggest example of how the Deku principle was a real phenomenon. When she first met the man, she could see he was dripping with a type of self-hatred, paranoia, and anger that almost always led the person to violence, and the way he wore those emotions like a second skin made it so that it was near certainty. But Deku-Sensei put Dabby in just the right place to ease that anger. It was slow, but the negativity drained from the man as he interacted with everyone day to day. He had some bad days and Deku-Sensei's presence made Dabby annoyed. But his emotions weren't nearly as toxic as they once were. She could even feel it as he was begrudgingly gaining fondness for Iguchi-san and the softness he felt for all the children. A feeling he was trying to hide from himself out of some kind of guilt. And that wasn't even beginning to touch upon how he changed the very environment of the South Side as a whole. Places often held the weight of the emotions from the people who lived there. So she noticed when the years of built-up suffocating oppression was dissipating before her very eyes. It still baffled her how one person could change so much and uplifted so many people of their personal prisons by just coexisting with them. And she wasn't even thinking about how much he changed the other red light districts and their people. But it had to be similar to what happened to the South Side under his watch. But it did give Madison some hope that maybe people weren't so one-dimensional and could make changes for the better. Madison was drug out of her musing when she felt the razor-sharp feeling of panic lash across her skin. Her head whipped to where the feeling was coming from, and she ran towards it. The shop she worked for was nearby the edge of the South Side, and so got some outsiders bold enough to dip their toes into their territory. Turning a corner, Madison saw little Aki being carried off by a woman surrounded by nefarious intent that wanted to do unsavory things that made Madison's skin crawl. She felt frozen for a second, having only encountered this kind of thing once before, and when she about to scream for someone to help, she choked on a wave of protective fury that could have only come from one person. And judging from how Aki's eyes lit up, she wasn't the only person who noticed, because almost immediately Aki bit down on the woman's arm. The woman cried out and Aki took advantage of the distraction to kick herself out of the woman's arms and ran over to Deku-Sensei. And though the boy was smiling, Madison could feel that he was seething and that his aura was pulsing with his outrage. Maybe if Madison did not know what the woman had planned for Aki, she might have felt a small amount of pity for the dumb woman for what she had unknowingly unleashed upon herself. Deku-Sensei had made a list of rules back when he started teaching out of the community center. It was a small set of rules that boiled down to no criminal activity around him when he visited, and there had only been 2 new rules added to that list. The first was made after 2 gangs foolishly fought on his property, and Deku-Sensei was quick to clarify that his property was neutral space. The other rule was more of an unspoken law that was silently enforced after the SSI. Any child in Deku-Sensei's territory is to be considered his regardless of who their parents or guardians were, and Deku-Sensei does not tolerate anyone that threatens his children. Deku-Sensei never said anything about it, but it was clear from his actions alone that he had a major soft spot for the children he finds in the districts. The simple and pure joy he got from playing with them was so all-encompassing it often made her eyes water. So it was only logical that when someone was idiotic enough to try anything, Deku-Sensei's rage was so cataclysmic that even those without empathy quicks could feel it. The woman, however, must have been blind, though, as she walked right up to him with a mask of politeness. But before she could open her mouth, "What do you think you're doing?" Deku-Sensei calmly asked, with venom only she could see dripping from his mouth. "I'm so sorry about my daughter. She has been throwing tantrums all day." The woman lied, trying to appear embarrassed by her wayward daughter. Aki, not having any trace of fear since she spotted Deku-Sensei, confidently stuck her tongue out at the damned woman from behind Deku-Sensei, while Deku-Sensei's grin turned sharper. "Oh, that's funny. I don't remember ever marrying you," Deku-Sensei coldly pointed out, his phantom smile not falling from his face as he tilted his head innocently to the side. "What?" the woman said, shocked. and Madison could feel a little glee nipping at the edges of her fingertips from Iki. Little Iki is my child. Her biological mother passed years ago, and I certainly never married you, so please enlighten me why you think you can take my daughter from me, Deku-Sensei questioned, and Madison could tell it was starting to sink in for the woman that Deku-Sensei wasn't going to just roll over for her. The woman dropped all pretense and began scowling. Listen, you brat, there's no way that kid's yours, and unless you want me to make your body feel like it's on fire, you're going to fuck off. The woman hissed, her hand reaching behind Deku-Sensei for Iki, only for Deku-Sensei to grab her wrist, and he dropped his smile, and the cloud of anger turned to smog as his rage boiled over. Do not touch my child. Deku-Sensei all but hissed at the woman, and maybe the woman would have kept pushing, but by now they had gotten the attention of multiple people, all of whom were very clearly not on her side, and Madison could feel their own protectiveness over Deku-Sensei overlapping and mixing to the point that aside from Deku's, she couldn't separate anyone's feeling from anyone else's. I highly suggest you leave, now, Deku-Sensei advised, and the woman must have had a shred of self-preservation, and she quickly backed off, pulling her arm out of Deku-Sensei's grip, and ran off unknowing of the few wandering eyes still on her. By nightfall the woman would disappear off the planet if she was smart. The Vespas would find out who she was and tear her life to ashes. Even if she hadn't provoked Deku-Sensei, the Vespas were strictly against child predators, and they would sell the woman's information to the highest bidder. The criminal underworld was often divided into two groups, the ones who hurt children and everyone else. It wasn't quite justice, and Deku-Sensei would never stand for it if he knew. But it was better than letting the woman get off scot-free, so she would keep her mouth shut, and instead turned her attention to Deku-Sensei. The boy's anger wasn't gone, but he quelled it to the point it was unnoticeable if you didn't know how to find it, and he instead was focused on cheering up Iki. As quick as Deku-Sensei's anger filled the area, it was replaced by the boy's care and compassion, leading Iki back into the inner bowels of the south side, where it would be safer, and Madison couldn't help scoffing at the thought. As far as the world knew, the south side was the most dangerous part of Japan, and those people were right. To a point, it all depended on whether you had Deku-Sensei's favor, and if you followed his rules. Because when Deku-Sensei was watching, it was probably the safest place in the world. Nezu blinked, staring at the different reports littered across his desk, and found himself in a rare state of bafflement. One of the skills his quirk allowed him to learn to fully retain all the information he read and collect it in an organized mental library. He had also learned to build through some books on visualization. And with this nifty little trick, he could easily recall any information he needed by going back through the shelves in the right section. Data that could be connected was easily linked for ease of access in his brain, and that made it child's play to find connections that weren't apparent to most. And currently that just made it all the clearer when he hadn't made any progress on a case. His request for other heroes to forward any information had been received rather well, and he had more than enough reports where Deku-Sensei was indeed mentioned, but there wasn't anything of substance in those reports. For the most part, it was just incidents where Deku-Sensei was said between two criminals in passing, and the few people that had been actively looking for info on the broker were quickly stonewalled. Nezu himself had seen such a thing for himself when he had been at the station to collect more data in person, and was blessed with a chance to watch Scripture interview a dealer for the Russians that she had overheard saying something about Deku-Sensei when the dealer wasn't speaking in Russian. He watched as the interview continued as expected until Scripture tried to leverage a softer sentence if he would tell her something about Deku-Sensei, only for the man to laugh at her. Do you think I'm stupid? If I told you anything about Deku, I would be dead by the hands of my own men before I ever made it to Tartarus. The man scoffed at her, and after that proclamation the man wouldn't say another word about anything related to Deku-Sensei. Nezu, knowing how the Russian mafia grew their members with an ingrained sense of deep loyalty to the members above them, and doubly so for members higher up in the food chain, as this dealer was found, the comment was alarming for several things that it implied about Deku-Sensei's position in the criminal world. Because if what the dealer said was correct, then Deku-Sensei, despite being an outsider, held so much power that a group based entirely in loyalty to their own that Deku-Sensei was placed well above their own high-ranking members. Of course, there was the possibility that Deku-Sensei was a member of the Russian mafia, but given his ties to rival factions, that was an impossibility. So it left Nezu with quite the conundrum. Because the only way he could think of a person gaining so much power with the group was as previously mentioned by either being in the mafia or have strong ties to a high member, but that wouldn't explain how Deku-Sensei could move about through any gang's territory without causing an uproar. Or perhaps Deku-Sensei had been around long enough to build strong ties or deals with the Russians, but that was just as hard to believe. The documents spread across his desk were from the past 10 years, the minimum amount of time necessary, and he had scoured them for any scrap of information that he could find that could hint at Deku-Sensei or his aftermath existing before September 72 and found nothing of the sort. Something that meant either Deku-Sensei was so good that he didn't leave any trace, which would have been impossible even in the current era, or Deku-Sensei has only been around for less than a year as he previously believed. The more Nezu tried to find out about Deku-Sensei, the more paradoxical the figure would become. Deku-Sensei had strong ties to powerful groups that don't take kindly to outsiders butting into their business, and has a presence that implied that they had been around for far longer than physically possible from the evidence. And they inspired so much fear that the criminals connected to them would never dare to double-cross them. He couldn't help thinking back on that old metaphor of Schrödinger's cat. Until someone could finally find Deku-Sensei, they would never truly know anything more than what Deku-Sensei could be, which made Deku-Sensei more interesting than most of his puzzles, but it also made him more cautious since Nezu began to suspect that whoever Deku-Sensei was, they were in the rare 10%. Human behavior was simple to understand with a little time and effort, and he has often made psychological profiles of criminals to be dispersed amongst both heroes and the police alike, but something that he did regardless of what they asked about him is he never gave a profile in absolutes and always a 10% part where the subject would do something unpredictable. And he did that for one reason: humans were complex, and there were some that didn't conform to logic. Nezu's go-to metaphor for this principle went as follows: lock a person in a room with one window and one door, and they will do one of a few things. 30% of people would do nothing and wait to be let out. 60% would try to escape the room. They could be further divided as so. 10% of them would try and fail. 10% yell and demand to be freed. 20% would try to get the door open. And the last 20% would try to break open the window to get out. And for that last part of the equation was made up of a very small portion of the population. About 10% of people would do something he could never predict, like reach into their pocket and pull out a key and just leave the room since they stole it earlier. Those 10% of people could be either the most dangerous or the most valuable people in the world because they couldn't truly be put into a corner. Aizawa Shota was an excellent example of the latter. A man that by all rights should have become a villain after all the years of abuse piled onto him for something as benign as his quirk instead turned into a spiteful, grumpy hero that was adored by most who knew him and absolutely loved by children and animals alike, while putting the fear of God into the students he watched over so they would survive in heroics. And much like he expected, Aizawa was the first person to give him something alternative to consider in his search for Deku-Sensei. A quirk that worked as an NDA was an interesting prospect and might hold some weight behind it if it had some measure of enforcement, as well as a way for Deku-Sensei to know if the NDA was broken. There wasn't enough evidence for him to codify it, and would keep the idea in his back pocket as he looked for more information. An NDA quirk would fill in some gaps, such as why people were so cautious of speaking of Deku-Sensei to certain people, and perhaps it would make it easier to work in favors, as he suspected Deku-Sensei did, since discussion of payment mentioned was rarely mentioned when people spoke of Deku-Sensei. His laptop dinged, bringing Nezu out of his musing, and he checked his email and saw an email from Himawari that he had an informant tell him that 2 low-level pleaders were talking about offering to work for Deku-Sensei in return for his services. A small tidbit that confirmed 3 things for him. 1. A possible gender for them to narrow down their search for Deku-Sensei as a person. 2nd. That Deku-Sensei had indeed been trading in favors as well as money for information. And 3rd, Deku-Sensei had workers underneath him in some kind of network. Perhaps that was how Deku-Sensei would get his information and why his poking around didn't turn up much in solid info on Deku-Sensei. Deku-Sensei might work entirely from behind the scenes, sending others in his place, which would explain his ability to move through various territories when people were normally so territorial. He'd need some time to reconsider some things with these facts in mind, but before he could really dig into these possibilities, Nezu heard footsteps heading toward his office. Knowing the sound of the boots by heart, Nezu didn't bother trying to put away his multiple reports in any big hurry. Instead, he moved over to the coffee machine and got it started. Aizawa proceeded to stalk into his office a minute later, and the man let himself fall upon the couch and groaned. Nezu's tail swayed behind him at a moderate pace rather than the fast pace it instinctively wanted to go at, and he had to restrain himself from chirping. Knowing that Aizawa still found his office as a safe space to distress, even after all these years despite the man's trauma with his previous schooling, was a point of personal pride for him. "Hello, Aizawa." Nezu greeted, a touch more subdued than his normal cheer in case the man had a headache. Aizawa frequently escaped to his office if he was overwhelmed, a habit that developed during Aizawa's time as a student and continued when Aizawa began teaching here. The possibility Aizawa was able to find comfort in his presence because he himself was not a human being often resurfaced when Aizawa escaped to his office. Aizawa's ability to interact with other humans was severely lacking even when he was civil due to how cold he was to them. But he had no such trouble with the numerous alley cats he befriended, a theory he toyed with from time to time. "Facing a bit of trouble?" Nezu inquired with the tilt of his head getting some grumbling from the man, and he couldn't quite make out what Aizawa was saying given his face was buried in the couch. With a beep from the coffee maker, Nezu poured a cup, then sat himself down on the arm of the couch. Once Aizawa smelt the coffee, he lifted his head, glancing at him and revealing a dark U-shaped mark on his face. Before Aizawa moved so that he was upright enough to accept the drink, Nezu waited for Aizawa to take a few sips and saw a great deal of Aizawa's tension drift away. "Nemuri is being annoying, and it was giving me a headache. Couldn't nap in the break room," Aizawa explained rather curtly. Not that he could blame his former student. The naps he took throughout the day boosted his average sleep time to 7 hours. It was an hour short of the health requirement, but that was certainly better than just 5. "Well, your sleeping bag is right where you left it, Aizawa," Nezu briefly commented, jumping down from the arm and moving back to his desk as quietly as possible. Aizawa drank about half of his cup before he was alert enough to notice the piles of paper on his desk. "That about Deku?" Aizawa asked. "Indeed," Nezu replied simply as he began to reorganize the reports by district. He didn't miss how Aizawa scowled. "And they still won't green light an official investigation?" Aizawa scoffed, shaking his head, clearly annoyed. Nezu could understand why it was frustrating for most heroes that investigations required physical grounds, either in evidence or verified verbal testimony for permission to get an official investigation started. But as frustrating as it was, the rule was there for good reason. Heroes, despite being civil servants, were very powerful in modern society, and the only thing keeping the less savory heroes from starting witch hunts were these rules. "Not currently. How are things going with the Yaezu vigilante?" Nezu responded, switching the topic, and almost instantly Aizawa's mood soured and he sank deeper into the couch. "I managed to figure out a hair color, but I had to get a hoof to the face for my trouble," Aizawa answered, and that certainly explained the odd mark on the man's face. "Ah, what color is the boy's hair?" Nezu inquired, seeing as that was certainly an improvement. Given the area and the timing, it had been quite difficult for Aizawa to get a good look at the boy's features, even if he could get within 10 feet of the boy, much less from the many meters away on the rooftops, either a dark green or black. Aizawa told him, and Nezu filed that away for later when he looked through the public database for quirks. Nezu would have checked earlier, but there was one too few limiters, but now he had 3, and that should be enough to find a close enough match. Oh, and he'd have to look for any NDA-related quirks while he was at it. A quirk that's specific would have far fewer candidates for him to comb through. His left ear twitched upon hearing the click of heels approaching. Kayama is coming. Nezu warned, and Aizawa cursed under his breath, swiftly got up, then proceeded to hide under his desk and wrapped himself up in the sleeping bag hidden there. Aizawa had just managed to get himself settled when Nimiri was just outside his door. Kayama, come on in. Nezu called, quickly opening a random file and locking his eyes on the first paper. The woman peeked her head in and saw his desk full of paperwork. Sorry to interrupt, sir. I was looking for Aizawa. Have you seen him? She asked Amiker, given he looked like he was in the middle of important work. Kayama, like most students, found him unnerving to be around, and he gave her a nice little smile. I'm afraid not. I've been quite busy. Nezu told her, and Kayama nodded with a gulp. I see. Sorry, sir. I'll be going now, she hastily said, closing the door and swiftly leaving. He waited for Kayama to be out of earshot. I shall wake you when your class starts, Aizawa, he informed the man, and Aizawa gave a soft grunt of understanding before he tried to force himself into sleeping, something few would attempt while Nezu quietly worked above them, especially if they were smart enough to be wary of him as a super-intelligent animal. Yet Aizawa would paradoxically seek him of all people for comfort. Aizawa was truly an oddity that belonged to the 10%. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at UA. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomer Bill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you soon in the next video.